Welcome to day 2 of the conference, Creating Effective Warnings for All. I am Joanna Faure. No, I'm not. Hang on. Oh, glasses. Sorry. I am Elan Kelman, and I'm Deputy Director of the UCL Warning Research Center and co-organizer of this conference, which basically means that I do whatever Karina Fairley and Amanda Gallen tell me to do. So please, a huge round of applause for them. And welcome to this exciting keynote panel session on making the last mile the first, integrating bottom-up and top-down approaches at the WRC Warning Conference. And Joanna, unfortunately, being head of department of the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, did get called to an administration meeting. Not that bureaucracies have a lot of administration, so she will be here in about 15 or 20 minutes to take over. I'm just substituting temporarily. And wonderful to have our panel here today, who again are going to talk about it making the last mile the first. And a reminder that we do have an online audience. We're looking forward to your questions, your interaction, your discussion, and also the exciting movie night this evening. So be aware that we do have this social this evening for the exciting movie. The conference brochure, the program is online. We have some hard copies at reception if you're interested. For our online audience, again, everything is online. And please let us know via social media, via the question and answer in Zoom, what we can do for you and what's of interest to you. So, in order to start the session, I will immediately hand over to Toby. Thank you for being here, and you have 10 minutes to describe to us what your interests are.
Well, good morning, everybody. And I'm looking around the room, and I'm not sure whether my first comment is aimed adequately at this particular demographic. So do any of you here remember the English humorous duo, Flanders and Swan?
Yes.
Aha, there are a small number who do. Now they were back in the 1950s and 60s. Michael Flanders in a wheelchair, Donald Swan at the piano. They sang humorous songs. Some of you, even if you don't remember the names, may remember the one about the amorous hippopotamus. And they also had various monologues interspersed between the songs. And one of them was by Michael Flanders. And he talked about the phenomenon of going somewhere on an aeroplane, which in commercial terms was still comparatively new in the late 50s and early 60s. And he described the whole process from start to finish. And then he said, and then you get to the airport, and there's a big notice saying, beware low-flying aircraft. Pause. And then he says, there's not a lot you can do about that, apart from take your hat off. Now, that's a perfect example of a warning without a real purpose, because there was no actionable response suggested. And I thought of this 5 weeks ago when the government published the latest edition of the National Risk Register. That's the UK National Risk Register. You may have missed it. It came out quietly in August when Parliament was in recess, although actually low-key publication seems to be the norm or tradition. The previous edition came out just before Christmas in 2020. Now, there is no doubt that this edition is more detailed and possibly more sophisticated of any of its predecessors. Certainly, the 2008 register had 45 pages and highlighted 12 risks. The 2023 version, by comparison, is 191 pages and includes information about 89 risks. These risks are grouped into 9 risk themes. They'll be familiar to you all: terrorism, cyber, state threats, geographical and diplomatic, accidents and system failures, natural and environmental hazards, human, animal and plant health, societal and conflict and instability. You may think some of those overlap slightly, but that's the conceptual basis. Each risk is considered in terms of a reasonable worst case scenario, with highly unlikely risks discounted. The risks are then assessed in terms of their likelihood of recurring in the assessment period. That's 5 years for non-malicious risks and 2 years for malicious risks on a logarithmic scale, where those scoring 5 have a more than 25% chance of occurring through to 1 for those with a chance of less than 0.2%. This is coupled with an assessment of the impact of the risk concern, again on a 5-point scale, with the lowest category envisaging up to 8 fatalities, 16 casualties, and an economic cost in the millions of pounds, and the highest catastrophic, assuming over 1,000 fatalities, 2,000 casualties, and an economic cost in the tens of billions of pounds. You might think that this is over precise, given the uncertainties involved, but there we are, and that's what they're doing. These are then plotted on a matrix with the assessed reasonable worst case impact shown on one axis and the likelihood on the other. Now, the good news, the UK, is that there is no risk listed as falling in the catastrophic box with a likelihood of greater than 25%. There are, however, 5 risks shown as being catastrophic, but with lower levels of likelihood. Another pandemic falls in the second highest band with a 5 to 25% chance of occurring in the next 5 years. A failure of the national electricity transmission system, and you just think about what the implications of that would be, or a large-scale CBRN attack are shown as being catastrophic, but with likelihoods of 1 to 5%, while a civil nuclear or radiation release from an overseas nuclear site might have similar effects, but are seen as having a likelihood of less than 0.2%. And my non-technical eye looking at this suggests to me that perhaps that's on the lowest, that perhaps ought to be slightly higher up the threshold than some of the others. In the highest category of likelihood, over 25% in the next 2 years, so that's right at the end of the likelihood of these things happening. There with less catastrophic impact are various types of terrorist attack, the assassination of a high-profile public figure, or an attack on a UK ally or partner outside NATO. Also seen as being in the highest category of likelihood are a technological failure in the UK critical financial market infrastructure, a disaster in one of the UK's overseas territories, or a major outbreak of the plant pest Xylella fastidiosa. So obviously a degree of detail involved in all of this. The register goes on to give a brief description of each of the risks covered with an outline of the reasonable worst case scenario, the assumption behind that scenario, possible variations to it, what responses might be necessary, and the longer term impacts arising. These are necessarily, even in the lengthier document that we now have, these are necessarily sketchy. At the moment, further detail doesn't seem to be publicly available. So this raises the first big question about the register. A bit like that sign, beware low-flying aircraft. Who is the register aimed at? The document itself says quite clearly that it is not targeted at the general public. Although obvious, there are some existing focused campaigns already present. For example, in respect of terrorism, you have Run, Hide, Tell. You've got Weather Ready for climate risks, and those are all aimed at families or individuals and communities to prepare for and cope with severe weather. You also got Cyber Aware, which is about obviously staying secure online. These are all pretty general, and there is nothing for the rest of the 89 risks. The register also contains a chapter aimed at organisations that might have a role in communicating preparedness information to members of the public or to employees, with a series of examples of actions that could be suggested to individuals. This rather begs the question, if you are advising organisations who are going to tell other people what you might do, why don't you just tell people what their reaction might be? So what you really need, in my view, is something which gives people practical advice in the event of some of the risks or threats actually coming to fruition. Now, other governments elsewhere in the world, and I'm sure some of them will be represented here today, are able to guide their citizens in this way. In Sweden, there is a booklet for households, if crisis or war comes. The booklet format, incidentally, is important. Citizens are unlikely to proactively search for the latest advice on a website unless they first know it exists. And secondly, they may not be able to access it when crisis or war actually happens. A hard copy is therefore a physical reminder of the need to be prepared and could be quickly and easily consulted, even in the midst of a power outage or internet failure, two of the risks which are clearly important on the register. The register is ostensibly designed for what it says are a broad range of risk and resilience practitioners. Some of that broad range of risk and resilience practitioners may indeed be in this room. Examples given are those in the voluntary and community sector who may be involved in responding to emergencies. So if that's the case, it might have been helpful then to have included information explicitly aimed at practitioners that suggests that they might suggest what they might actually do to respond and prepare for the risks identified. Businesses are also expected to use the register to understand the most serious risks that could impact on their business continuity. Now, this is an important aspiration, but perhaps typically of UK government, it lumps all businesses together, whether they're small and medium-sized enterprise, alongside those which operate the critical national infrastructure. And as the risks are described very broadly, with only high-level information about the potential impact and response requirements, useful guidance for those who operate, say, a corner shop, will need to be very different from that which is relevant for those who run a manufacturing business with 300 people working for it, and that in turn will need to be different from what will be useful to, say, a CNI supplier that may be international and have 20,000 or more employees. Now, there are other problems with the register, which is not really the scope of today. It omits reference to what it calls chronic risks, such as climate change, not unimportant, antibacterial infection, and artificial intelligence. It assumes that business as usual risks, such as, for example, the state of the health service, are being effectively managed by the relevant government departments. I might say that is an heroic assumption. And there is no consideration of simultaneous or overlapping risk events that may amplify each other and create cascading consequences. However, my fundamental point, perhaps my only point relevant to today's discussion, is that telling people the risks that we face is not enough. You have to equip people with what they need to do. And that is exactly the same for all of the warnings and alerts that are being talked about here at this conference. Warnings and alerts, and for that matter, the National Risk Register, need to be actionable. You have to know what to do and how to do it. They have to be relevant to the recipient, whether you live in a high-rise or in a rural area, whether you are a small business or a multinational corporation. And they have to be relevant. Both the warning or alert and the proposed actions should be developed in consultation with those who are the intended recipients. And if we can make progress on that, I think we will have made a very useful contribution to taking these issues forward. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Toby. That's fabulous and very powerful. Given the audience of the risk register, it doesn't seem to be at ministers, but certainly they should read it. So how could we get ministers to read it and to act on it?
I rather suspect it's been pored over by ministers to make sure that it doesn't include any hostages to fortunes or any expectations that they don't feel they can fulfill. But there is an important issue, and I was discussing this just before we started, about identifying who clearly is responsible for dealing with the risks concerned. There is, in parallel to the National Risk Register, but it doesn't mention it in the document itself, there is a list of what they call LGDs, lead government departments. Unfortunately, the list of lead government departments doesn't map neatly across to the 89 risks on the risk register, but most of them are there, or you can work out what they're getting at. But unfortunately, some of those lead government departments, there are 3 of them identified to deal with a particular risk. So it's not quite clear who the lead is. The second point is that a responsibility that just has to be done by officials down there, or is it something where there has to be political responsibility? Now, my view is that the government machine only works when there is political leadership and political commitment to it. So therefore, the responsibility for ensuring that action is taken has to fall to ministers. And I'm not quite sure that that lesson has been taken.
Thank you so much again. So thank you so much, and I will now hand over to Valerie, and also we will switch the chair to the real Joanna, the head of the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. Valerie.
Morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Because I tend to shout. Not too loud. Give me a wave. Okay. I've had to stand up because Toby stood up, and I must be a bit of a sheep. But let me first start by introducing myself. So my name is Valerie Risk, and it is my real name. I didn't change it by Pearl. I married Mr. Risk, but it's a very apt name for the environment in which I now find myself. But let's be clear. I am not from a multilateral. I'm not from disaster agency. I'm actually from the private sector, and I've worked in the private sector for a very long time, helping lots of different businesses and systems innovate and change how they think about things and how they do things. And 3 years ago, I had the privilege of being able to join a US company called Everbridge. And within Everbridge, there are some amazing companies, including one-to-many, UMS, Previstar, that pioneered technology such as cell broadcast and location-based SMS and software for preparedness. And I got to come and work with that team, and I didn't know much about this world or what they did, but I was very eager to learn. So today, we stand here and we actually protect from and support governments to protect 2 billion citizens around the world, which I'm very proud of. But there's much more that we as a community can do. In my first couple of months, I remember talking to Chris, who's in the audience, and he was talking to me about a project in Africa, in Malawi, in fact, and I was really interested. There was a localized flooding problem in Malawi, and there'd been some brilliant work done, all about mapping the topology, working out the rainfall patterns, modeling, analyzing, strategically placing lots of sensors in places so that they could know that a flood was going to happen. And I was fascinated and said, wow, that's really brilliant. So how does it help the people on the ground? Well, we haven't really thought about that as a system. We know it's coming, but we don't have any budget left. We don't have any design around how we're going to let the people in the path of the flood know it's coming so they can take some action to protect their lives, to protect their livestock, to move assets, to do the right things. That last mile hadn't really been considered, and the people that all of that brilliant work was meant to serve weren't going to be served. And coming from the outside in, I was like, that can't be right. And that's something that we need to change. I then was working on some projects in India, and some brilliant work had also been done. All of the research and the design, actually the implementation of systems that did alert the communities. But because of the financial modelling that had been done, it was all CapEx, and it was a 2 or 3 year project. And after 2 or 3 years, there wasn't the understanding or the processes for adoption long term. They hadn't been put in place. So you've got sirens, you've got infrastructure that's no longer in use, despite the best intentions and the best plans. So that situation, I thought, right, from a CapEx, OpEx perspective, from a design thinking perspective, what can we do as a community to change some of that thinking? But there are many complications. There's so many stakeholders. There's governments, there's communities, there's citizens, there's academics, there's consultants, there's researchers, there's multilaterals, and there's the private sector. And who's accountable out of all of those people for making sure that the end-to-end works so that you can know something's going to happen where you can, that you can have planned and prepared for that in the right way, with citizens informed about the actions they need to take, that you can respond in the moment in the most effective way, move your assets around and protect people. You can recover more quickly, and you can actually then, measure the positive benefit of the system, the action, the investment for the communities on the ground. And what does success look like in this area? Is it faster economic recovery? Is it lives saved? Is it a great report? Is it working systems? I couldn't find a very clear view of what success was. And there are some hydromet reports about if you've got this system in place, economic recovery can happen, much quicker. There's a 10 to 35 times return on investment. But I don't think there's a collective view that everyone's aligned behind about what success is. So what can we do about all of that? The first thing is, I think we can learn from what others have done before. Because there are many industries where people have had to think about the end-to-end life cycle of a project, long-term adoption, long-term support, and long-term outcome. In the UK, people may be aware there was a lot of PFI, PPP, so there are lessons that we can take from other areas. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of really great insight, there's a lot of intelligent people doing some really good thinking about this. But I agree with Lord Toby, actionable intelligence is really what we need to be driving for. How we can then take that action and turn it into outcomes for people. And someone talked yesterday about the power of people, the power of process, and the power of purpose. And all those things are here, but how do we get them organised? How do we get the donors involved to talk about funding models that drive long-term adoption and benefit? How do we convince and engage with governments to involve citizens and communities in the end-to-end design so that the citizen and the community is at the heart of the design process and the thinking? How do private sector get involved? We heard yesterday from ITU, GSMA, where here is a private company. There is knowledge and there is expertise in the private sector, and pushing private and public together and creating that collective intelligence could really accelerate progress. Know about it, plan and prepare for it, respond to it, recover from it more quickly, create long-term resilient societies, save lives, protect livelihoods. This has got to be our ambition, And this is where the pillars of the early warning for all can act as anchors for all of us collectively to be that change that needs to happen, to take all of your great work, all of the private sector's great work, and make it count for the vulnerable citizens in our world. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. It's really interesting there, the points you raised about the problems with projects on warnings and designing warnings and your experience there. And I'm sure there are many here who would echo those sentiments. It almost sounds as if people have forgotten the very basics of project management. Number one, who is this for? What is the problem? And who is it for? And then what do we want to do? As opposed to, oh, we've got some money, or we want to do this thing, and then we'll figure out if it's helpful or not. So I wonder, my question to you is, do you think with warnings we would make more progress actually learning basic project management, or is it about better knowledge about warnings and the people?
I think, of course, it's both. I was talking to Ray yesterday. Is Ray here? I can see Ray. Hi, Ray. Ray's a project manager from government. And we were having this very conversation about there's so much intelligence, but unless you can come up with a very practical plan to actually deliver, there can be a lot of really good ideas and a lot of really good practice and a lot of really good knowledge. But if you don't join the dots end to end in a practical way, you can't drive the outcome. So I think we can improve everyone's knowledge about the art of the possible. We can now communicate to the last mile. We can create two-way communication. A lot of this stuff already exists, but it's raising everyone's awareness of the possibilities from the insight through the action. But then also getting back to basics. It's an end-to-end system. There are many other industries that have tackled these problems. So what can we learn from them? And my plea, involve private sector, involve the MNOs, the GSMA, the ITU, companies like ourselves, because we've got that practical business experience that drives for outcome.
Thank you very much. So it sounds like you're going to be getting a lot of questions in the break room. I now pass over.
I'm staying here.
You're going to stay there?
Yeah. So hi everyone. I am so delighted to be here. I think it's just really wonderful to have this amount of people that have so much experience and that have contributed so much to the work of early warning and early action. And I actually, when Alan asked me to do this talk, I thought, well, Ian has been such an amazing person, always bringing the idea of the lessons that we need to learn from the past, trying to really bring that history, that I thought, well, I am going to go to the memory line and I'm going to talk about all the amazing things that many of us online have done in the world of early warning and early action. So I'm going to invite you to come to my time machine. And we're all gonna press the button and we're gonna go to a very critical moment of time for the world of early warning systems. So who can tell me what is that moment? The moment that shaped, in recent history, not the Roman times, recent history. What shaped the system? What event? The tsunami, great. So we're in 2004 and we have one of the most painful events that have shaped humanity and the humanitarian world, development world. We were checked out. We're like, this cannot happen. And what do we need to do? We need to change the system. And one of the fundamental aspects of that disaster is that the early warning system failed, or there was not even an early warning system. So that really moved all our deep fibers inside of us. And there was a couple of really important people that started to analyze what happened, what can we do better, how do we change? So around 2005, 2006, somebody who is sitting in this table with me, a really amazing person, started to do an answer. He started to do one of the most fascinating analyses of early warning systems under the leadership of IRDR, and did this global survey of early warning systems. And it was this really brilliant assessment that really looked at what is going on, what do we need to improve, what are the gaps, what do we need to change. So a lot of the things that we keep on talking and talking actually come from a lot of that analysis that was done back then. So thank you, John, for all your efforts in all this time. Now, at the same time, within the Red Cross, there was something very interesting cooking. And I have an Argentinian person sitting here in the audience that likes to cook a lot. And he was cooking a really fascinating idea that will transform the humanitarian system and the way how we do early warning and early action within the humanitarian system. So Pablo, with a couple of other people in the Red Cross, started to think, well, what are the gaps? Why this is not working? And there was among the many gaps, there was one piece that was very important for humanitarian action, was that funding mechanism that could allow to do early action based on a forecast. We normally have funds for response, but not really a fund that could be activated based on forecast. So in 2008, Crazy Pablo go and propose this crazy idea to the International Federation of the Red Cross, like, let's use this forecast for West Africa because there's going to be a really terrible flood. Let's disperse the money and let's do some early action. And the Federation, there was a really great guy at the Federation at that time, he's like, yeah, let's do it, why not? And it happened. First time ever a humanitarian organization released funding based on a forecast. It was in 2008. So thanks to that, and a lot of the things that were cooking along those times, the movement started to create. I was in Haiti in 2010, and for me it was a revelation to see how, in a way, early warning and reaction to really reach the 1.5 million IDPs that were at that moment in Haiti could be reached with our forecast. Because what happened? We had several tropical storms and rainfall after the earthquake. And because we have a humanitarian system that was in place, that had the funding, that had the logistics, we were actually able to do a lot of early action work in the middle of social mess. And for me, that's a big milestone. I think you, John, were somehow as well involved on that process with UNDP. And I think it's something that we don't talk a lot about much, but it's a really important milestone because the level of impact and humanitarian drama that was huge, and we managed actually to do a lot of early action for those people in the most horrible situations in the camp. So for me, that 2010 is like a really key milestone. Now, 5 years passed, and then what do we have? One of the most important years. And it's interesting because just before 2015, in November 2014, what happened? Somebody? A really big disaster as well. End of 2014, Haiyan in the Philippines, which also changed the system. Because we basically, what happened is that had a med service, which is absolutely magnificent, but still there were 6,000 deaths. And there was a glitch in the system related to communication, and people confused because they thought it was tsunami, but it was a time storage. So there's this really interesting analysis like, oh, I mean, why this system failed? It was a communication like failure in the process. So just right after that, then we have 2015, with like so many things happening. And there was a very special moment for me in particular. Someone called Mickey Glantz, we cannot talk about early warning systems, we don't talk about Mickey Glantz. And he created this absolutely brilliant event. Nairi, do you remember what that event was?
That was the lesson learned?
Exactly. It was a lesson learned event in Turkey. It really brought all the Med community down to more with practitioners to really think about those lessons from the past and try to think what can we do better, what can we change. And that would just follow by Sendai, which you already know what happened in Sendai, and something very important also happened in 2015. John, what happened in 2015? Cruise was created. So, yes, we'll talk about it later. So Cruise was created at a very crucial moment in the world of early warning and early action. So now, we have 2015, that excitement, so many things happened, everybody really kind of like keen on transforming the system. Within the humanitarian sector, there was something very important that happened in 2018. After all these tests that Pablo did in 2008, we managed to transform radically the funding mechanisms of the humanitarian sector. And we created the first ever financing mechanism within the Red Cross that any Red Cross in the world can access based on a forecast. And that was in parallel to what the START network, one of our lovely colleagues, Luke Kelly, is working on, setting up the same system for the NGO community. And then in parallel, the UN system was there following, starting by FAO, and then basically created an anticipatory action window for the SERF. So this is 2018, 2019, an absolute transformation of early warning early action within the humanitarian sector. Now, there are a couple of really important things happening in the meantime, particularly on the Met world. And this growing idea of impact-based forecasting, a lot of the work that Brian has been doing over the years, you just get all these pieces of the puzzle, start to get putting together. It was a beautiful moment where everything started to get together. And we got to a point, and I think I recall some of your words in terms of like, if we want to have these big changes, we need to have that political will. At the end, that change at the big level, institutional political will, is what is necessary and is what is going to continue the transformation. Then RIP was created. So RIP come in with that really big policy, big ambition, and then in parallel, we also felt the gap, and we saw, well, there is something that is also missing. We have this community of organizations, this community of people that is working towards this joint objective, and there was not really a space for that. So we decided to create something called the Anticipation Hub. And that hub is that knowledge management community that brings all together. And then what happened in 2021, Milan?
There was a thing called a pandemic.
Oh, I forget about it.
I think we were in the 7th lockdown when you came up.
But you were so productive that you decided to create the Warning Research Center. So then you see that constellation of different things that happen. You have RIP with that policy element, you have the Anticipation Hub, you have the Research Center, crews continuing doing amazing work, amazing research projects. Wiser, I mean, I cannot even name all of them. So there's all these incredible things happening. So, and that's where we are right now, that this is where we are. We have all these absolutely brilliant things that we all need collectively celebrate. But what is complicated is that the challenge that we have and the challenge that we have ahead is quite big. So we know that the systems, although we have advanced so much, they are not ready to the point where they need to be. So I think there is definitely that need to continue working, to continue collaborating. So the creation of these type of spaces, Ilya and Catalina, are like extremely important. So one quite quick thing in all this journey, that particularly something very personal to me, that when I was working on this for all these different years, and for me there was always a missing piece of the puzzle. And going back a little bit history, in 2005, I had my first emergency response in Colombia, and it was in a community that was forcibly displaced by conflict and had horrible floods, and it was absolutely destroyed. And that was for me like a big call of attention. I always had it on the back of my mind. So when I started on the world of early warning systems, and then we had that blind spot of like, what is happening with all these people that have been affected by conflict, that are not really reached with early warning? We're not really getting there because they are very remote or very difficult to access, or violence is a problem. So I started to work a lot on this topic. This has become like one of the key topics that I am kind of like pushing forward and moving forward. And I welcome all of you to join the Anticipation Hub to continue the discussion. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to share this story with all of you. Thank you.
Catalina, thank you. I feel like I've just been in a lesson. This is wonderful, reminding me of all these dates. It's interesting. I find often in disaster science, we talk about it in terms of history of disasters, what went wrong, and then what we learnt. And then we talk about the next disaster and what we learnt, and the next disaster, what went wrong and what we learnt. Do you have any room in your timeline for an example where we learnt before the event. We took anticipatory approach to our own learning, or an example where you can actually say, this went wrong, we learned this, and then this didn't go wrong the next time. Is there any positive part of the timeline that we can really celebrate, as well as these things that have been set up and the initiatives that you mentioned, but in terms of actually showing, yes, they've worked, yes, they've helped, and there's a positive element to this timeline as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think these big events are like the shakers, but in between, there is a lot of work that happen and a lot of like learning and exchange. So I think these quiet moments are actually like one of the most powerful, because it's when we get the work done. In terms of like the big lessons that we say like, oh, wow, this is really making a difference. I mean, one that is very like dear to our hearts in the climate center in particular, and I think Catalina has been very close to that as well with the British Red Cross. In Mongolia, there was an activation of an early warning system, trying to really like support the different pastoralist communities to reduce the mortality of animals, and there was this really incredible use of the system, and we managed to do like a really robust evaluation of that, and which is so incredible and eye-opening just to see how that evaluation really showed that reduction of risk, that reduction of mortality of animals, like the impact per se. So I think there are a lot of examples. Like this is something that is being very at the forefront of the design of a lot of these systems, is having like the evaluation of everything that we're doing. I mean, of course, it's not perfect by any means, and sometimes numbers are too inflated, I would say. But I think there are really like positive aspects.
Thank you very much. And then the next question is, you presented your timeline. Imagine I'm going to do my own version of the time machine with a warning that it's a safe time machine, as in it doesn't work at all, but it's very safe because it doesn't work. Imagine now we're at this conference in 3 years' time, 4 years' time, 5 years' time. I'll let you have a bit of margin of error on that. What's coming? What's exciting that we think we can do, that we can think about, where we're not saying the same things we said at the conference 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? What is it that's coming next? What can we get really excited about? What are the audience thinking? I'm going to be talking about that in 3 years' time, 5 years' time. I'm going to be asking questions about that in the future. It's not an easy question, I know, but you can take it. So I'll do it.
I got it. Yeah. So the dream is there are a lot of dreams, but we always talk about a scale. Like a scale is, we have beautiful examples here and there, but what we know is that we need to do it like big. The way to do it big is that at the end, government needs to do it. We need every single Ministry of Finances, Disaster Risk Reduction Agency, and many other agencies to actually include early warning within their processes. So in a very concrete example, I would like every single government to have an early action fund for the setup of the systems and for the implementation of early actions, like having that by law, and that is really integrated within the government processes. Like if we manage to get that, particularly in those countries where cruise is actually working, that would be the top. No pressure, man.
Thank you. I love the amount of pressure you're putting on people here. It's warning to everyone should have come at the beginning that you're going to get pinpoint and get different questions. So thank you very much. I would now like to hand over to John. Are you going to stay here or are you going to stand up? You're staying here. It's a free for all.
Thank you, Joanna, and good morning to everybody. And I'd like to start by thanking Catalina for reminding me just how old I am. And actually, the reason I'm not standing up is if I combine my size with my diminishing eyesight, I can't read my notes if I'm over there. So I'd also thank you, Catalina, for that very thought-provoking reminder of the timeline of early warning where we stand, and I think it's actually quite useful to do that. I would add one aspect to that timeline. The tsunami was the real turning point when we were working on early warning. Actually, and following the tsunami, we did do a rather extensive assessment of early warning. It wasn't the first one. In 2002, we had already convened the international community around early warning systems. And that was a very junior professional in the UN system at that time. And we actually did a number of regional consultations to try and assess where the bigger gaps are, target financing and technical assistance. And in Asia, we had this workshop. It's so long ago, I literally cannot remember where. And we had colleagues from this from the Pacific Tsunami Center who came, and they were saying that based on all our assessments, there's a really high risk for tsunami in Asia. And there's no early warning systems. And I remember thinking at the time, really, is that a part here? Is it all these big hazards that you have in the region, in Asia, tsunamis, anyway, we kept it, we included it, we did include it in the report, and we shared that report with governments. And no actions were taken. And I often think back at that, that responsibility you have when, with these risk analysis that we do, Lord Toby presenting his risk register, and the fact that that doesn't always translate into the kind of action that we'd like to see, and we do have responsibility for that. Anyway, that's just a little addition to that to that line. So as you understand, my name is John Harding. I work on I manage a trust fund called Climate Early Warning Systems Cruise, which is listed at the World Bank. The Secretary is actually based in the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva. And it's a finance mechanism that's specifically dedicated to bridging the capacity gap on early warning in what we call one of the countries, in the least developed countries and small island developing states. And the reason is quite simple, is because the casualty risk of losing your lives in those countries is actually going up. In fact, globally, where that risk of losing your life is going down, and it's going down because we have these better capacities in monitoring early warning systems. I must say it's really nice to be talking in the context of an academic institution on this topic. We need a lot more of that, and so thank you very much to Joanna and colleagues for it. A few years ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced a special report in each 3 months. And it was a very interesting experience for us, because it was the first time we were really looking at a proper assessment of what we know and we don't know. And actually, early warning systems was one of the areas where we discovered we don't have that much proper peer-reviewed and scientific literature to support a lot of principles and that we think are sort of accepted facts. And obviously, one of those accepted facts is the topic of this discussion this morning. This first mile, or formerly known as last mile aspect of the early warning systems. And this is an area we could obviously benefit from a lot more knowledge and research. So we're looking at the warning center, but obviously we'd like to involve other academic institutions into this area. It's interesting, we use a lot of terms to describe this first mile. We call it end-to-end warning systems, people-centered, early action, risk-informed early warnings. We have all these different terms. All the terms are based on the same understanding, is that you can invest as much as you want in the infrastructure, in the monitoring systems, in the science, in the institutions themselves, and operational procedures produce very timely warnings. Those warnings will never be effective if they're not anchored in a strong understanding of who are the people and institutions at risk, and how those institutions and people can prevent the risk, the type of information that we provide. So it's a well-accepted principle. It's been a well-accepted principle for a while, but I can tell you from the perspective of a mechanism that is financing, that there's a certain amount of technical assistance in countries and programs, 100 million plus currently in different countries. It doesn't translate always into operational reality, even though it's a very accepted principle. And it's quite challenging to understand why. There's certainly lots of guidance. We have a lot of guidance documents. I don't think we need any more checklists of how we should be doing it. There's plenty of those. We often get pinpointed us as financing institutions. We say, as financing institutions, you would actually like to, you prefer to finance weather stations rather than focusing on more people-centered purpose warning. It's not as simple as that. Actually, as finance institutions, our programs are developed based on the demand and the needs of the countries identified with the national stakeholders. So of course it depends a little bit who you're talking to in the country. If you talk to a Met service, a meteorological service in the country, then their go-to request will be for more weather stations or better computers to be able to access global weather products. Because of course, if you don't have that basic capacity to actually predict those extreme events, there's no warnings that you can communicate to anyone. So it's true that is often the case. That's the first demand we get. But when we start working with those institutions and we go on the journey, we do find some very inspiring stories of those same institutions on trying to better understand the needs of the community. We've been working in Burkina Faso, providing climate seasonal forecasts, so medium to longer term predictions for the small scale agricultural communities. And in those communities, it's often the women who actually manage a lot of the crops. And so the national institutions, the Meteorological Services and the National Disaster Office, they actually had to work through women leaders and women groups to understand better the needs of those communities and the type of information to provide. And it's not about just the type of information, but when you listen to them now, it's actually would come down, they communicate through this community radio. Depending on what time you provide that information through the radio, women will be coming back from the field, they'll be looking after the kids. So they're actually listening to the time much later than the men in those communities. So even you have to understand how different genders access the information and work with them very much in advance. And when we get that right, of course, then that work is really well. So I think one of our challenges is to document a lot better some of these success stories and share it between communities, and that's something we're very keen to be doing moving forward. But I'll stop there, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. So you mentioned the first mile, the last mile, the people-centered, and all these things, really making that the truth. When we're trying to evaluate, or when we're trying to question, are we actually doing that? We've looked at lots of these projects where people sort of say, oh, but that's really difficult, or that's really hard to do, or if there isn't an event, how do we actually go about trying to do that? Whereas if you build a system and someone can see it, and it's physical, it's there, you can say, that's what I've done. And that's easy. You can make it clear. So when people are looking at financing, you can see the appeal of saying, yep, definitely done that, it's there, a problem has been solved. Whereas the parts you're talking about are perhaps harder to show that impact, to show that that's made a difference. So I wonder, what do you do, or what do you think we can do to help people really understand that that is needed, and that does make an impact, and that will improve things, not just if there is actually an event, but in all the time in between as well?
Thank you, Joanna. That's a bit the story of my life at the moment, to be honest. So yeah, it's true that it's very difficult to demonstrate evidence of what the success looked like. So how have we been successful in achieving the last mile? Which in a way is surprising, because as an international community, we've actually, one of the big changes in 2015, Catalina was mentioned, that countries actually agreed to measure themselves on a number of targets, and so they decided, all countries decided they were going to measure, for example, how many people lose their lives to disasters. Yes, so that's a big step, because obviously one of our main objectives is to save lives with these early warning systems. So when all countries are saying, okay, so we can actually see, we can probably see then sometimes economic losses the same. But one lesser known target that they agreed to measure themselves against is actually access to early warning systems, target G. So all countries are now supposed to every year report on how many good access early warning systems. And we actually collectively don't actually know how to measure access to early warning systems, strangely enough. Anyway, so that's how I say story of my life. We're actually hoping to use this early warning role, let's say, dynamic, try and better, let's say, be more robust in how we show the effectiveness of the systems that we put in place. And of course, we also have to show the effectiveness of our investments. So we measure things like how many hazards in the country have we developed a predictive capacity? It's much easier to do that, or how many countries have we put in place to come learn to literally can tick a box and, maybe exaggerate a bit. But as soon as we come to how many people have access to that predictive capacity put in place, and I'm not even talking about then who actually took action on it and so on. We're not even at that stage at all. Then it becomes a lot more negative. But we are making progress, and we as part of our programs, we now in each one of the countries we actually work and calculate with our partners how many people access the warnings that we put in place. But the fact is that it's a bit of the front line now currently of our system, how to show effectiveness of investments.
Thank you very much. Okay, so warning to everyone in the audience, online or in the room. It's now your turn. So, making the last mile the first mile. It's now your turn to answer some questions to our wonderful panel, who have already entertained you, but will do so and continue to do so. So please, we have some mics around the room. Do put up your hand, do ask questions. Let's keep going. So there's one actually there, right at the back, that came up nice and quick. If you can take the microphone up. When you ask a question, if you could say your name and affiliation, and please do use the microphone as that helps those online here. And I'll be coming in a moment to those online as well with questions. Are there any questions already from those online? Are there any questions online already? Any other questions? We've got one at the back there. We've got two down here, so we can take these two together. We can take these together. So we'll go at the back there. We'll then come to these two. If you could raise your hands again. So can you see? Yep. And then we'll come to those online. Thank you very much. So remember, please do say your name and your affiliation when asking your question. How do we make the last mile the first mile?
So my name is Bob Goldhammer. I'm with the International Association of Emergency Managers. The question that popped into my mind is it seems like every disaster we have, the first thing we hear from people is they did not get a warning. So Catalina, as part of your 5-year dream, do you think we will ever get to a point when a disaster occurs that we will not hear that statement made, which would indicate that we have actually been a little successful?
Good point. So this is my idealistic me. Yes, I mean, it will be a dream that, for example, every single person living in refugee camps in this moment in the world is able to receive a warning before there is a flood or a heat wave. We should aim to do that. My realistic side of me, it's a little bit complicated in terms of the scale. You want to every single person at rest in the world to be able to receive, and there are so many factors behind that. So it's gonna be difficult, but I think we have the ingredients to make it happen. I think we are in this tipping point of all these different elements that can't really make that magic happen. And it's so positive that we will be able to do it.
Hi, Bob. That's our mission. That's what we spend every day of our working lives doing. It's making sure that multi-hazard early warning systems across multi-channels reach every single person. There are 2 billion people on the planet today that will get alerted if there's any sort of incident, and that can be climate related or any other type of thing. So there's already the systems in place. There's already 25 to 30 countries that are protected in that way. It's how do we scale that and how do we help people understand the art of that possible and join all of the dots and motivate government and this system to actually execute on that. So, we've got to execute.
Could I just add to that? I mean, there are some issues, obviously, in terms of using sort of the mobile phone as being the main means of communication for this. Clearly, there will be parts of the world where that is not as prevalent as it would be in countries like the UK. But it comes back to my rather central point is, what is it that you're communicating? It has to be meaningful to the people who receive it. And I think my worry is that though governments and those who send out the alerts through those systems will be so wound up by their own protocols as to what they can say, what processes they have to go through before they say it, that they'll lose track of. I'm the recipient, something clearly bad is happening, I want to know what I'm supposed to do. You know, as crudely as, do I turn right or do I turn left? Or do I stay in my building or do I leave my building? And I'm worried that not enough thought's gone into as to how to make that meaningful to those who receive it.
It sounds like you're advocating a people-centered approach.
You might say that, I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, there is a lot of thought going into that. I think on the point of having,
There's a lot of thought going into that from people who are emergency response experts, even thinking now around two-way communication, how people who are on the ground can be coached and supported to be the first responders while the emergency services are mobilised. So there is a journey to go on, Toby, I agree, but it's very actively happening in many places. It's just how do we connect everybody to those realities and lessons in the right way?
I'm quite clear it's technically possible. I'm quite clear it could be interactive. I'm quite clear that you could do quite nuanced messaging and so on. My worry is I think there is still quite a long learning curve to go within government agencies about how they can make the best of this system. For example, in the UK, we now have an emergency alert system. It's only, I think, 11 years after the trials demonstrated that this was hugely successful. But it's not the most flexible of systems. It simply relies on self-broadcast. It can't be quite specific, and it can't be interactive. Why are we not going there? Many other countries have started that process.
Okay, thanks for the question. I have a slightly different perspective on that one. I mean, you started by saying, when we have a disaster, and so from the moment you have a disaster, you've had a failure in the system in a way. You can imagine that if you have an extreme event and the early warning system works perfectly and all the policies that you've been begging for work perfectly, on paper we shouldn't have a disaster. It would just be an extreme event. So of course, when you have a disaster, the chances are that you're going to have people who are going to complain about the lack of early warning system. And I live in a country which has a very advanced capacity to very advanced service, very advanced capacity to monitor these things. And every year we're going to have a certain number of extreme events that are the system fails to pick up and because for different technical reasons. So we're going to have we're always going to have these extreme these disasters. And that will reflect the failure of the system. It doesn't mean that the system don't work. I think that's what we have to, a clear message that we have to put to the light.
Thank you. We have two questions here. If you can remember to say your name and who you are. Yes,
I'm quite loud
So it's really just oh, of course, sorry, yeah. Oh, is that better? I'm Nori Kinder. I work at the Met Office in the UK, and one of the challenges that we have, we're a pretty established Met Office. We've got amazing partnerships with private sector. We work with Microsoft and Amazon Web Services, and I won't know the rest of the names of all of them, but one of the things that we discovered working internationally with other Met services is they lack a lot of confidence in engaging the private sector. And I think it's a little bit like sometimes when people are looking for the weather forecast, there can be a lot of noise out there, lots of different people providing information, they're not quite sure where to go. And you mentioned Valerie risk in your presentation that, already at this conference we've heard about GSMA and the work that you're doing and IT you're doing with early warning for all. So what would your advice be to Met services in terms of
potentially giving them the confidence to engage, but also having the confidence to choose the right system for them. Because obviously not every system is going to work. And also, how do private sector view the idea of collaboration with each other? You know, it's quite a sensitive trail to tread, working with private sector, where you have a lot of different agencies in country, and it can be a bit like, well, if you're dealing with them, you're not dealing with us. So how do you help, any ideas of how to navigate that as well? Great. And thank you so much, the panel. It's been fantastic to have that trip down memory lane, and also such a lovely, relaxed environment.
Thank you. If we could take the second question there as well, just behind you at the same time, and then we'll take a couple of questions from online, and then I'll ask the panel to sort of answer them together. Thank you.
Hi, Elise Belcher from Global Network of Civil Society Organisations for Disaster Reduction, GMDR, which is a bit easier to say. Your question was, how do we make the last mile the first? I think my question back to you is, why are we still treating the first mile as the last? I think the rhetoric, as you said with your milestones, there's been amazing work done over the years, but the rhetoric continues to be, how do we make sure we engage the people? How do we scale up this system so it's working better in more places? How do we sustain this new technology? Why aren't we locally led from the start? Why don't we say, is the perspective of the person who is facing that disaster or living in that area that is most at risk from multiple hazards, whether they be geographical, social, natural, anything, that cascading risk that has been mentioned, start with them and then work the system out. So in slight promotion of GMDR and in partnership with DKH, a German organisation, we tried to document that and said, what does locally led anticipatory action look like? And we've taken who is on the village committee, how are decisions made in this community, and we trialled it in Southern Africa, Malawi, Mozambique, Madagascar. How does contingency planning, early warning, early action start from their context? And we've not found any documented work on that, because we constantly fall into the trap of, oh, here's a new idea, here's a new system, here's start work, Red Cross, we're all doing fantastic work, as you really clearly highlighted anticipation hub in your milestones, but it always somehow comes from an external perspective than a community perspective. So I guess just to really push back to the panel, what is that barrier that we're just still not quite getting right to start with a central, people-centered, but really start with people at the centre and move out from there. So just, I hope the next milestone will be the anticipation hub who we're working with to look at locally led anticipation as a briefing paper. And the next time you give your speech, there will be a little bit more of this kind of documented working action where it truly is people first. But yeah, maybe some reflections on that to really push. Why is this not happening still? Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're going to take one or two quick questions from online, and then I'm going to ask each panel member if you could sum up and answer these questions in the same go. So you don't have to address every single point raised, but between you, hopefully we can. Thank you.
You're lucky because it's related. So I think part of it has already been answered. So it's the last part of the question that is probably the most important one. It's from Dr. Geoff Main from the University of Exeter. Actually, we have a lot of questions now, but the first one, is technology in early warning systems becoming a panacea? Sirens, radio, media, leaflets, cartoons, etc. Should there also be appreciation of the local knowledges of early warnings and actions and how we can utilize these, particularly for small islands? We know from islands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans of traditional knowledge that helped to reduce casualties in 2004. Is that a way of making the last mile the first?
Thank you so much. If I could ask each panel member, and we're going to go in reverse order to the way you started, to reflect on those questions and any other points you have. We have just over a minute each, so off you go.
Thank you, Joanna. I'll be very brief. Just two examples of that reflects that's hopefully a positive feel like we're going in the right direction on this last mile aspect, and it relates also to traditional knowledge. So actually, some of the countries who have decided to finance the technical assistance and through their bilateral aid, they've attached enough importance to this last mile aspect that they've actually asked us to develop what we call operational procedures. What it means is that they're actually asking us to have, first of all, procedures in place. So every time we start any discussions in the context of a country, we have to demonstrate that we've talked to the people or organizations who represent the people at risk. These could be women groups, it could be organizations that reflect people with disability. Again, depending on the context, it can be a very wide range of different types of people. And we also have to then showcase, we actually have to measure financially then how that has translated into the investments and how much money is going into one another. So, and we had to, the donors through us then hold our technical partners to account on these different aspects. So it does show a certain interest. There's a long way to go still, but I think it's really a step in the right direction. And out of those, we are seeing nice examples, and actually it's in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific, of specific tools being developed, which interestingly is not just about the local knowledge, it's linking the local knowledge with the more advanced kind of prediction services that are developed in the same regions to understand how they can benefit from each other. It's not one or the other, they have to be well interlinked together. So there are good examples there as well.
Thank you so much. We'll come to Catalina next. So, yeah, very good point from GNDR. I come from the community-based early warning system school, so I really relate to a lot of what you were saying. I think what we need to look at when we think about early warning systems is that there are different levels. Also, you need to have that institutional level transformation, you need to have national level transformation, and you need to have that community level transformation. So certainly there has been a lot of work on that institutional level transformation, and to some extent the national level transformation. What I see clearly is that traditional community-based disaster risk reduction, and that includes early warning systems, is not to the level that it should be. And the issue with that is that it's a complex, it's about, we need to reach every community that is at risk should have a risk reduction plan that will include what is going to be the early warning system. That is the ideal, that we want that in the world. I think the issue is really it boils down to political will, it boils down to finances, it will to reach that level that every single community has a multi-hazard early warning system that is activated by the community, that is linked to that institutional system. And with that national system, hopefully we'll get to that point one day, but I don't think we have yet the level of investment and political will that is necessary. But I tell you, that it should be the starting point. And I think we need to, I've always said this, we need to stop funding these isolated little here interventions of DRR projects here. It has to be strategic. It has to come from an understanding of where in a particular region are the most high-risk areas, and start the investment strategically to tackle in a cluster process like that. I think we can get to that scale through that, but I think there is a lot of work to do that.
Thanks. Practically, we've shared this last mile journey for public alerting, multi-channel with 25 countries. And we encourage those countries to share their learning with other countries that are thinking about the journey. We're just in the process of going to facilitate a government-to-government user group so that those governments that are further down the experience curve can help others understand how to do that, and then share all of that collective learning through the Early Warning for All programme so that it's accessible by any country that needs the confidence to take that first step. And practically, when we're working with any community, and it could be community level, state level, national level, we tend to do mock drills, tabletop exercises with the community itself to help inform the design and the thinking of the process so that it is very people. So it's quite practical. And then we take that and we try and share that learning across many other projects. So that's a private sector approach, but it's design thinking, and then that collaboration and shared case studies and references and learnings, government to government, because that's where we need to crack.
Look, I've got a confession to make. I am a recovering politician. So I have a degree of sympathy for politicians and public officials in trying to resolve this stuff. But what's being said is absolutely right. This has got to be community-based. If you want your communities to be resilient and to be prepared and ready to deal with an emergency, to respond to whatever alerts, and you can deliver them technologically or by old-style means or whatever else happens, then you've got to recognise that every community, every neighbourhood will be different. So it can't be a top-down approach. You discover something which works wonderfully, whether it's in Tanzania or whether it's in the northwest of England or wherever else. We'll have one of those everywhere. And of course, what the reality is, it quite often revolves around a local, charismatic individual who gets their colleagues, their neighbours, and so on to do things. You can't replicate that. What you've got to do is create the environment in which that happens. And the problem with that is it's complicated, it costs money, it's slow, some things will work, some things won't. You'll put a bit of money into something which turns out to disappear into the charismatic individual's pocket. All of these things will happen. So it's genuinely difficult. But the reality is, unless we invest more in local communities, local resilience, and in local preparedness, we're not going to be able to achieve that objective you were talking about of everybody being able to be plugged in to an emergency alert system which actually works. So it is something which has got to take time and be invested in, and recognising it will look different wherever you have it. It's not just within one country, it's even from different neighbourhoods, even adjacent neighbourhoods will approach it and need to approach it in different ways. And that, for politicians operating at national or international level, is very difficult to deal with.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Lorna to come up and give her a graphical summary. While she's coming up, I want to say a huge thank you to our panel. I learnt a lot. I felt I went back to school, which was great. Certainly got some insights, and thank you to all the audience. Apologies to those who had questions and didn't want to answer, didn't get a chance to have them answered. You will have other chances in the conference. So sit there burning on your desire to ask a question and be ready in the next session to do so. Thank you to Lorna.
All right. Sorry, I got stuck in my chair for a moment there. Let's see if that's the right way around now. Yeah, let's see.
Yes. Yes, it's there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've been drawing along. On the top, you can see the 4 different statements, and on the bottom, I've put down some of the points from this discussion and the questions. So I'm just going to zoom in into some of the points. I'm not going to tell you everything, but yeah, you can later on then explore this graphic on your own. In the beginning, there was a talk by Toby Harris. I started with the warning without purpose, or with the guy whose head is being lost due to the airplane, and then the question: so who are these warnings aimed at, or who's the registrar in this case aimed at? I've put down some of the catastrophic events that you mentioned. I did not know quite where to order them on this scale, so I've just put them down here as a word cloud. And the question still is there, like with these overlapping events, like for example, if there's a flood and a fire, what to do. But in the end, it's to equip, or the idea is to equip people with relevant, actionable solutions for these disasters.
Right, and then for the next one, there are many projects with many sensors and lots of data, but often the locals are forgotten in this process, so there needs to be like a structured design and long-term solutions with the private sector, and I've put it down as sort of a recipe for success. What is the problem? Who is this for? Like this project management of talking about these issues. Then we had this time machine by Catalina, Jaimie, with the global analysis of the early warning systems. I put down some of these different aspects here. Also, a lot of success in between, like overall, the transformation of the humanitarian funding system, and the idea to please join this hub because it seems like a good idea. And on the right side, by John Harding, sometimes that action might not be taken by governments, even if it's mentioned in these reports, that the first mile needs to be people-centered early action, and there are enough guidebooks and lists, but the question still is how to reach this population, and it's difficult to measure like who is actually reached then. And on the bottom, I've added some ideas for the successful early warnings, or these successful early warnings, to connect the agents, learn from each other, have clear guidelines, what needs to be done, and on the right side, that it needs to be community-based, and I put on strategic and pragmatic. This is kind of what came to me from these last points.
Thank you so much, Lorna. And her graphics and the other posters being produced are all available, so you can see them and follow up on them. It's now break time. We ask you to be back in your seats, ready for 11:15. You will not receive an early warning for that, so please take it upon yourself to be ready back at 11:15 after the break. Again, thank you so much to the panel in particular, and we look forward to the next session.